What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Outlier podcast. We have a familiar face, our friend Doomberg, ready to help us explain the universe. So I'm actually excited to ask you a bunch of questions. A random one to start. Do you know the first time that they found human beings buried next to dogs in like the time frame of
Wasn't on my radar for today, so I can't say that I know the answer.
14,000 BCE, or I guess BC,
Huh?
depending on which version. Yeah. I have like a weird book in my bathroom that it just has like the history of the world. And that one just really struck me because it shows me like how bad I am at like understanding the BC timeline. I don't think I ever, like in my mind, I never would have guessed 14,000. It's a very strange
Yeah,
time.
it seems like a long time to have domesticated dogs, but what do I know about the history of dogs?
So, speaking of domestication, what do you think of the current trajectory right now for specifically? I want to start with the broader plan that Trump has trying to onshore more production. We talked about that quite a lot last time, and there was a couple things that have happened since the last time we spoke, and even a couple things that literally just happened a couple days ago with the new tariffs,
Sure.
statement on semiconductors. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on like how that's going. Is it achieving the expected effect, or do you think that we've essentially gone off script?
I think by and large it's going better than most of his critics would have feared. Um, and I would partition how it's going into two buckets.
Okay.
And then the sort of integral of those two will converge on the topic du jour, of course, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. And that's going to dictate much of Trump's economic success for the balance of his presidency. If you partition the world into countries over which the US has escalation dominance and countries over which the US does not have escalation dominance, we see two wildly different stories. Now, fortunately for Trump and his agenda, the US has escalation dominance over a lot of countries who happen to be economically important. And one of the tests of whether the US has escalation dominance over a country, for example, is does the US have a military base in that country? So the US has escalation dominance over Germany, over the EU, over Japan, over South Korea. And in those countries, largely speaking, Trump has gotten more favorable deals, tariffs at much higher levels than people thought were possible, and they're mostly accepting it. And the economy will reorient and rearrange itself. And all of this will be, it's sort of paying the vig to the mafia don, is the analogy that my friend over at Thematic Markets, Marvin Barth, who's got a new Substack that I enjoy quite a bit. He wrote a really great piece about thinking of the Trump administration as though it's the sort of Cosa Nostra, right? And so to the sort of the countries over which the U.S. has power, they get their military defense umbrella from the United States Navy or Army, or pick your favorite branch of the military. That's going fine. And in fact, I think on average, Trump is on a trajectory to potentially raise six, seven, $800 billion from tariffs as a consequence of that policy, and that's meaningful. That's a third of the budget deficit, right? And having accomplished that, now I should say up front, by the way, this is all blatantly unconstitutional. Congress has the sole power to do these things. Congress is silent on it. The courts will eventually weigh in on it. It's going to set up a constitutional crisis, but put all that aside. I mean, Trump is Trump. Trump is doing Trump things. And I saw a great post on Twitter, like 300 years from now, Trump will be a mythical figure that people won't believe existed. And I think that's probably a fair assessment of the man. We have mixed views on him, of course, but he is wildly entertaining. Okay, so then there's the second bucket. And those are the countries over which the U.S. does not have escalation dominance. The most important of those is China. And China proved first time around that, there's a saying in diplomacy, which is, never bluff China. China holds the cards. We wrote a piece, I think 2 years ago, called Geopolitical Warfare, where we described how it was a conscientious policy of the Chinese Communist Party to spoil their environment in order to get monopoly control over the earliest parts of critical supply chains possible that they could do with just brute force like this. And I competed against the Chinese in various supply chains in the late 2000s, 2010s, and I saw this pattern play out time and time again. I saw it play out in solar, saw it play out in rare earths, saw it play out in the various aspects of electrical grid critical pieces. And so when China has a weakness, it finds the earliest stage in the supply chain it could dominate with brute force, financial force. And one of the prime financial tools it uses to put Western competitors out of business is it allows its national champions to pollute with abandon, which makes it far cheaper for them to produce their product. Rare earths, magnesium, various critical, minerals and materials that nobody's ever heard of because it's never been important. It was important enough for the Chinese to dominate, and they did it, and credit to them. But as I vividly recall in my time in industry, the West is as much to blame for this as China. So, it's hard to compete on price when your competitor's idea of a water treatment plant is a pipeline to the river. And big article in the New York Times last month, recognizing this, kind of 2 years after we wrote it, with pictures of giant, toxic swamps of residue from the processing of rare earths that China leveraged in order to gain monopoly control over that part of the supply chain. Most surprising to us is that even though this is widely known, flagged, many people in the military industrial complex and strategic planning knew of this, were flagging this. The USGS put out a whole report on it. The Trump administration in the Liberation Day tariffs and in the early skirmish of the trade war with China, I guess, didn't think that the Chinese would use this, and they did. And we in the US were weeks away from automotive factories having to close because China was holding back critical materials. Now, Trump is aggressively trying to close those vulnerabilities, but it's going to take years. And so China will call the bluff, and reorienting the relationship between China and Russia is going to be challenging because everyone in China assumes that the US wants to go to war with them. And for a very measurable period of time, which I think is measured in 3 to 5 years, the US will be very vulnerable to an economic war with China. Now, we can go in many directions, but this is our state of affairs, sort of high-level look. It's working pretty well over the countries where it should work, and it's not going to work with China.
So with something like China, what's the perceived path forward then? If this brute forcing approach isn't going to get it done, then what does the future look like between the two countries?
It all depends on whether Trump succumbs to the forever war disease and views China as a potential military adversary to attack as opposed to defend against. And if there's a world where he could cut the grand deal, where Russia and Ukraine is solved, Middle East peace is solved, and China is solved, and Trump is the kingmaker that he campaigned on being, but he's fighting a rearguard action against the part of the permanent Washington, D.C. establishment that I think he doesn't really like or trust, and Lord knows they tried to put him out of politics and perhaps even off the planet. And so one wonders why he pays so much attention to the likes of Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and so on, understanding, of course, that he needs to get legislation through Congress, but he's got his big bill through Congress. The one critical aspect of his domestic policy was passed. Everything else is kind of nice to have. And so part of us thought that after the one big, beautiful bill passed, that we might see a reshuffling of his cabinet, an exodus of that wing from his administration, a little less emphasis on his relationship with Lindsey Graham. And I only say Lindsey Graham because he's a poster child for that wing of the permanent Washington, D.C. establishment that never saw a war it didn't like. So time will tell. Big test coming up, of course, with the meeting with Putin. Who knows how that's going to go. You could kind of get a sense for where Trump is by observing who is in the news that day, Keith Kellogg or Steve Witkoff. Keith Kellogg being the sort of face of the Lindsey Graham wing of Washington, and Steve Witkoff being the face of what I think Trump would like to be. He's a real estate guy. They've known each other for a long time. Very loyal friend of Trump's, legitimate loyal friend of Trump's. And so the fact that suddenly Witkoff was back on the scene and going to Moscow, and the Russians are now talking about the Trump administration having presented an offer that they find acceptable. Lord knows we don't know the details. They could have just been talking about the offer to have a summit. Broadly speaking, the fact that Trump and Putin are meeting, assume they do, tells me that there has been some kind of breakthrough in the negotiations. But we find it so puzzling to see, Zelensky posting about the need to have Europe in this meeting. So there's still this sort of classic chasm between what Trump wants to do with the Ukraine-Russia situation, which is to walk away from it, and what the Europeans and the Ukrainians and half of, the political establishment, or maybe 80% of the political establishment in Washington, D.C., doesn't want him to do, which is to walk away from it. I think if he had his choice, he'd have walked away from it early. Probably overestimated his hand, Trump being Trump. So we'll see. Who knows what's going to come of this summit? It's the great mystery of the day, assuming it even happens.
Another thing we talked about, not to pivot too hard, but peripheral on kind of analyzing really some of like Trump's policy and decisions and broader impacts since we spoke last. But one that really stuck out to me was you were mentioning $50 oil. What are your thoughts on the timeline for that kind of thing, and what might that look like?
Yeah, I observe with interest that OPEC keeps ramping up production. I think the path to $50 oil is $5 natural gas in the US, believe it or not. And for reasons I'm sure we've discussed in prior episodes. But we're working on a piece this weekend on the refiring of old coal plants with natural gas on a huge scale, where 85% of what was once a power plant and will be again goes to data centers and 15% goes to the grid. And so it's not like destroying demand, or crowding out demand on the grid. It's actually adding to it, but you get all this, bounty of natural gas in the U.S. If natural gas in the U.S. were $5, oil would be 50 or below, because all the people that co-produce both would dump their oil at any price just to produce more natural gas. For those that aren't as familiar with the energy markets as you and I are. But OPEC keeps ramping up production. If the U.S. and Russia reach a peace agreement, I think oil drops $5, $6, $7 on that news, virtually overnight. The big question, of course, is whether the 12-day war reignites between Iran and Israel. I think there is some geopolitical risk baked into the market, although not that much. I think our equilibrium price for oil is $55, for very obvious reasons. Not obvious reasons, but like for reasons that we've talked about before. 5.6 times landed LNG at $10 a million BTU gives you $55 or $56 oil as an equilibrium price. And so whenever we see wild swings from that equilibrium, we know that there's significant geopolitical risk, or perhaps glut on the other side. And then last thing I would say is we noted with interest when the CEO of Diamondback Energy was out worrying about a developing glut in the oil markets, two sources of incremental supply coming online in a big way. Of course, with Guyana, Exxon's got another floating platform firing up down there, and then Vaca Muerta in Argentina, a little bit of a dark horse. I was reading in Market Vibes, Sir JJ, great trading newsletter on Substack, another friend of Doomberg's, that I think they did 720,000 barrels a day last month, and they're projecting to double that by the early 2030s. And so there's plenty of supply. The world is drowning in hydrocarbons. And so $50 oil is a pretty decent target. Right now, I think we're at 63, 64. I haven't looked today. That's $7, $8 above the equilibrium price. Pretty reasonable. And so, I think the markets are very well supplied. When I look across my Bloomberg Launchpad to assess the overall state of the energy markets, what do I look at? I look at the price of coal. I look at the price of natural gas in the US. I look at landed LNG in Asia and Europe. I look at crack spreads. I look at the spread between Brent and Brent and WTI, sorry. And everywhere I look, coal, cheap, natural gas in the US, cheap, landed LNG, dormant. The markets are signaling that they're very well supplied. And absent a significant geopolitical event, the long-term real price of all commodities is lower, um, except for gold, but gold isn't a commodity. Gold is a store of value.
We're going through like a pretty significant earnings season right now, obviously, unlike the trading side of the world where I live. So I don't know how closely you guys follow. I imagine still pretty closely. Um, what are the key technological impacts that you're seeing come out that have the greatest potential impact on energy writ large?
I think great question. So AI, obviously, and by the way, there's a lot of hype around AI, and there's undoubtedly echoes of bubbles of yesteryear and what we're seeing in the market. Great trading opportunities for guys like you, no doubt. But AI is real. It is transformative. Right now, what we see is an AI arms race largely outside of and insulated from the traditional business world. And I think there's going to be a lot of money to be made by those who can just tunnel between one to the other. But that actually doesn't necessarily require as much AI expertise as it does business execution expertise. We've played around with a few AI startups that were involved in with that as the whole business strategy. You know, like Doomberg's a blog. There's millions of blogs. Disciplined execution still matters. You can know enough about AI to do something very useful in the regular world, but so few of the AI startups and the people participating in the arms race have any real business experience. And so that's the sort of broad view of AI, and then drilling down into the energy applications for it. It's already very widely dispersed amongst the majors, and we're seeing lots of innovative things happen. And I think so. That's one. The other is drilling, of course. Drilling continues to get ever more fascinating, indistinguishable from magic, really. But there's two risks to that. Well, not risks, I mean, inevitabilities, really. Again, the reason the long-term real price of all commodities is lower is because technology is disinflationary, and the energy exploration and producing companies are technological powerhouses. Because they're price takers, they're forced to continuously invest in efficiency and improvement, which then begets the next leg down in the price of their product. So, for example, the break-even price of natural gas in Appalachia is like $2 a million BTU, which is $12 a barrel oil equivalent. At $5 a million BTU, they'd be printing cash, companies like EQT and Range Resources. And that could come with data center demand because even $5 a million BTU is just $30 a barrel of oil. But the drilling technologies does open up the potential for three significant disruptors to the energy markets. One is the sort of whole taboo concept of abiotic oil, which we believe China is embarking on a very deep drilling national campaign in order to tap into extraordinarily deep sources of effectively limitless methane, natural gas. The other is natural hydrogen, which is, again, another potential game changer where you just have huge pockets of hydrogen trapped underground and you naturally drill for it as opposed to having to take water and split it, which then makes hydrogen a particularly poor energy carrier. If hydrogen is actually a fuel you can drill for at scale, that would change things. And then the last thing that drilling technology unlocks, perhaps the most likely and the closest, is geothermal. There's a whole range of startups that are using cutting edge drilling technologies developed by the shale revolution and reorienting them towards extracting heat from below the surface and putting that heat to work to make electricity and other things, right? And so again, one of those is going to hit, maybe all of them are going to hit. And so those are the types of things that we enjoy researching and writing about.
What do you think about the broader impact of AI infrastructure on energy? We talked a little bit about that before, things like grid instability, but I'm thinking more broadly beyond like just the grid, but in terms of overall demand.
Yeah. So we consider ourselves lateral thinkers, and one of the attributes of lateral thinking is you have no emotional attachment to an axiom. It doesn't have to be true. It just needs to work. And one axiom we've been playing around with for a long time is that the human endeavor is infinite compute. So, in other words, humans will arrange their society around staying on Kurzweil's exponential computing curve, no matter what. Um, and that's actually a pretty good model that explains a lot. And in the case of AI, again, we do believe we wrote a piece called Irreconcilable Differences that you can't do AI on grid. You can do it off grid, or you could do the hybrid approach that I discussed earlier, where you are still contributing to the grid and the grid serves as your backup, because you need really, really strong baseload performance in order to keep these data centers running. But this project that we're going to profile in this piece, which is sort of driven by EQT, is 4.4 gigawatts, 7 gas turbines. 85% of the power is going to go to the data center that's co-located right there. Basically, these are giant machines that take methane and spit out data. And we're going to see wave after wave. We're going to see purpose-built nuclear plants, probably on military bases first, so that you could circumvent a lot of the permitting stuff and use, all of the advantages that the U.S. military has when it wants to get stuff done. I think that's coming because AI is, of course, a weapon of war, among other things. And so all this talk about, peak energy demand and all this nonsense, it's just so infuriating because you have no idea, A, what you're talking about, or B, what the human endeavor is. Like, this is what humans will do. More for more sake, more compute for more sake. Who knows where it's all going or who's controlling it all, but you don't need to know such things to think laterally. The human endeavor is infinite compute. One of the reasons why China is probably not going to militarily invade Taiwan is because it would knock humanity off of that infinite compute, right? That's the sort of linear lateral thinking that you can deductively reason if you're willing to have no emotional attachment to the correctness of your axiom, and it just needs to work. It's kind of like being a trader. Like, who cares what the underlying is? If you think it's going to go one direction or the other, then you're just going to bet on it. That's kind of how we think as well. So yeah, I think it's a huge source of demand. All this talk about it being a bubble is sort of the classic sort of short seller crowd that thinks everything is a bubble. Having seen what's going on at the cutting edge, and believe me, I'm as skeptical as anybody, and I've had a history of not believing stuff. I've fully converted on AI as a disruptive tool and source of future energy demand. The current stocks that are priced in the trillions, or who knows, that's not as interesting to me as what I see happening on the open source, by the way, which is completely unregulated, total free for all, zero guardrails on really scary, dangerous stuff going on in the open source. But at the same time, it means that a small startup with a very bootstrap budget can create a business, making existing businesses better, leveraging those tools. That's where the angle we're kind of trying to play with. But it's going to be transformative. I mean, again, the dot-com bubble was a bubble, and the internet still transformed everything. And that's sort of the analogy. It's almost become cliche, I suppose, to say it now. Not particularly interested in the bubble stocks. I'm interested in the technology and its impact, and that's going to be very profound.
If you were to think about the impact and you were to project it out over like the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever timeline you want, but I'm thinking like a couple different increments, like what do you think the near term might look like compared to the midterm and the longer term, however you choose to define those periods?
Yeah, it's a hard problem because it's moving so fast, right? Humans don't think in exponential terms. They tend to think in sort of, linear terms. And so um, we do think a couple of things will be real and real important. Um, they may not be the most important, but they seem evident to us. One, experts will become vastly better. Human experts will become vastly better, the ones that embrace AI. It has made our work process amazingly better. Um, you know, uh, if you know what you're doing, even the current AI tools are excellent lead generators. Um, Not necessarily fact generators. There's still hallucination issues. But if you take Perplexity, for example, one of the reasons why we love using Perplexity is because it gives you links to its, justifying its answers, and you can go and double check it. It still gets things wrong. I enjoy arguing with AI until they admit defeat. Um, it admits defeat, I suppose. But I think there's going to be a vast acceleration of the inequality gap. So if you're not in a place where using these tools comes natural to you, you're going to be left behind. Um, Another thing that it's going to do is it's going to radically increase the value of all things authentically human. Um, there's a huge sort of instinctive revulsion to many, many people in society to what's going on. The yearning for authentic human interactions, supporting authentic humans doing authentically human things really well. That's going to be substantially um, accelerated because of AI. And we see it. And of course, we're in the content world, and you see the early hints of this in the content world, which I'm happy to get into. But provably authentically human is going to skyrocket in value, and technologies that can authenticate are going to be extremely valuable. Because there's going to be a whole ecosystem of humans consuming what other humans do, appreciating what humans do. Um, and so, yeah, that's another one. Then the last one is there's a whole, you know, array of jobs that AI or even AI-powered robots probably won't ever be able to do, at least not in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Mike Rowe, Dirty Jobs, was way ahead of his time. The trades are going to become exceptionally more valuable. You know, the U.S. in particular has, I believe I saw again on Twitter. I wish I could like give people the credit who actually came up with these things, but it's been vastly overproducing elites, people with college degrees that the market doesn't want, um, and significantly underproducing HVAC technicians, carpenters, painters, um, you know, small engine repair, um, the types of jobs that used to be a vocation that you could support a family, buy a house, get your kids into college, pay for it without a huge amount of debt. Um, those are going to become extremely valuable. The US in particular needs to rebrand what, quote, raising a successful child means. Um, so yeah, that's our view. And it's probably a little philosophical for you, but
Well, it to me at least it shows a really, really important component to this broader discussion, which is just how multifaceted all of this is.
yeah.
And when analyzing systems that are that complex, it gets really challenging to be precise across the board. And also, I think just understanding the splintering effect of like what this leads into that, and then so on and so forth, the chain effect, which is just absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, we're putting together a presentation for this month's Doom Zoom, which is for our, you know, our premium tier called Lateral Thinking, where we talk about the difference and how to do it, and you know why it's relatively rare, but still pretty valuable skill to learn. And we do that all the time, and so we're just going to, you know, open up behind the curtain, look at how we do it, and try to teach our pro subscribers some of the tricks of the trade. But it's an important tool. It's a fascinating way to look at the world too.
Yeah, without a doubt. So
Mhm.
when we're analyzing actually in this exact way, what is like a primary disconnect that you see current state between energy policy and the reality?
Yeah, energy policy in the Western world is aspirationally ignorant, is the way that I would describe it. It has become disconnected from physics precisely because the energy companies have become so good at producing an abundance of incredibly cheap energy for the rest of society to enjoy. So we put out a piece this morning, not sure if you saw it, on the whole situation in Australia. And in that piece, we described in very, very basic terms why it is inevitable that Australia's grid is heading towards very serious challenges. And I could explain it to you briefly here. The operation of a grid comes down to reliability. A grid that is just 99% reliable is practically useless to a developed country. You can't really do heavy industry with a grid that's only 99% reliable. And in fact, in the US, the grid operators are held to what's known as the 1 in 10 standard, which is no more than 24 hours of downtime over 10 years, 99.97% reliability. In order to achieve grid reliability, you have to be exceptionally good at demand matching. Too much electricity being produced is almost as challenging to handle as not enough. And grid operators really have to balance almost to perfection 24/7, 365, producing the exact amount of electricity that the grid is demanding moment to moment, minute to minute. In order to do that, you need to be able to control your power sources, right? So there are three types of power sources: those that are baseline, those that are dispatchable, and those that are intermittent. Baseload, sorry, not baseline. Baseload, dispatchable, intermittent. Baseload, nuclear, coal, natural gas, they can run 24/7. Dispatchability between those three, nuclear and coal, not so much. It's kind of hard. They have long ramp times up and down. But natural gas is extremely dispatchable, like measured in minutes. So natural gas, in a way, is a fantastic fuel to operate a grid because it is both baseload and highly dispatchable. Another example of that is impounded hydroelectricity. So where you have a giant dam with water pooled behind it. Baseload with some intermittency measured in months or years, but broadly speaking, baseload and highly dispatchable. And then you have the intermittent renewables like wind and solar, which are neither baseload nor dispatchable. The grid needs to make room for them when they decide to show up, and it needs to cover for them when it's nighttime or the wind doesn't blow. And then finally, there's batteries, which are dispatchable, but they're not really baseload. You can't really build enough batteries because they have to be recharged, right? And so the amount of batteries you would need to convert batteries into baseload is just absurd and prohibitively expensive, no matter what the price of batteries eventually drops to. And so right away, you can see that a grid with just wind, solar, and batteries is absurd because there's no baseload. And you can't have enough batteries to make up for when the wind doesn't blow for weeks at a time or when the sun doesn't shine overnight every day. And in fact, California is running into this because it's called the duck curve, right? The sun comes on during the day and leaves at night, and demand spikes just as people get home. And the delta between the peak solar production and the demand once solar is gone is what the dispatchability needs to be, and their dispatchability can't really cover that. And so they end up having to export huge amounts of solar power for dirt cheap prices during the day and import expensive power to paper ore for solar at night, which is why California predictably has the most expensive electricity in the country. Same situation is happening in Australia. They have added so much solar and wind, but have not meaningfully increased the amount of natural gas. And in fact, it's shrinking in its share. So they're replacing baseload coal with intermittency without having dispatchability. And the grid's running into problems. It just melted down again for the second time in one of their provinces in May. This is highly predictable. And we laid it out very clearly in the piece. When intermittency exceeds dispatchability, things begin to break. Why regulators don't know this, why grid operators who do know it don't speak up more loudly against it is a mystery. Wherever you see substantial penetration of intermittent renewables, grids become more expensive and less reliable and therefore less useful to industry, which is why Germany is deindustrializing and why everybody's leaving California. It's just that simple.
I want to go a little deeper on that second to last point, because it is really interesting to me to try to understand the game theory behind like that decision, right? Because it wouldn't benefit California to have a less viable grid. So I have to imagine that there's got to be some sort of back end thought process as to like that preference and understanding at least part of that trade-off. Do you think it's like disillusion where they think like, yeah, okay, the grid people are saying that, but they're going to say that, we think this? Or do you think that there's like some other, maybe not super logical, but at least some other thought process going on behind the decision?
You know, Kelsey Grammer once starred in a show called Boss or The Boss, where he played the mayor of Chicago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that show. And the show centers around the grift of a large project at O'Hare. And our admittedly cynical view, which we've arrived at after exhausting all of the other possibilities, is it is a grift at its core. Um, and you need a huge swath of ignorant politicians to execute that grift. And we have no shortage of those. And so California is a single party state. All single party states eventually devolve into corruption and graft. By the way, Texas is a single party state, and we're seeing significant signs of that happening in Texas as well. This is not a partisan issue. Any and all single party states or countries devolve into corruption and graft. And this is the great grift. The world is ending. We need to spend billions of dollars, and everybody gets to wet their beak. I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
Yeah. A little disheartening, but logically flows.
Forever thus.
I forgot where I caught it, but I caught something that I think came from you guys. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But it was about the process of like capital market pricing and national security risk.
Yeah, that's us.
Okay, I thought so.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, the two of the ways in which free market capitalism fails. By the way, huge proponents of free market capitalism in almost all instances, and it is undoubtedly the foundation of the wealth of nations. So I don't want anybody listening to think that we are socialists in any way, shape, or form. But sometimes free market capitalism fails. The two ways that are important to us at least, that the free market fails are: one, environmental degradation. It doesn't properly price it, which we've explained earlier. And relatedly, only because China decided to relate them, is in national security considerations. So the Pentagon has been flagging for a very long time that coring out U.S. Manufacturing base, especially critical supply chains needed for weaponry, was a significant national security risk. But Wall Street priced it as though it had to happen. Short-term profits, options, and there's all manner of Chinese influence across multiple dimensions of our economic and financial system and our political system. And the U.S. does the same in China. So it's not like, but they've been particularly effective at convincing American businesses that, in name of growth, they should outsource to China. But if China's really only cheap because it has, it abuses labor and abuses its environment, the market doesn't really price that in very well. And so that's why we praised so loudly this MP Materials deal that the Pentagon cut to try to re-onshore, critical minerals and rare earths and magnets. And it was a very innovative approach, sort of a quasi-hybrid, not quite nationalization, but government participation. The taxpayers pretty well protected by the fact they have preferred stock with warrants, and they get some upside. And but then the government, the Pentagon in this case, gives MP Materials a take or pay firm commitment so that they can then go raise the risk capital to build their magnet factory and sell their magnets at a reasonable profit that earns their cost of capital to the government. That's the way China kind of operates things. And if you're going to fight China, it's not just a military war, it's also an economic one. And they're wiping us off the battlefield on the economic war. To Trump's credit, he has an administration that is filled with people that have business experience, and they cut a very wise business deal and solved, or at least have embarked upon the path to solving a significant critical military vulnerability. And they will do 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 more of these deals. And a wise investor would be, it would be a good thing to try to figure out which other, heretofore struggling competitors of China's abuse of their environment are going to get an injection in a way that MP Materials did, because that's what's coming. The Trump administration has flagged this quite clearly. So, it is. I'll tell you a story. When I was in industry, I remember being a victim.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a super quick question.
Yeah.
Are you able to say what industry it is just for the context?
Sure. I'll just say it was in the renewables space because I was actually in the renewables industry, and it was in the solar space. And China was in the process of dumping solar panels onto the market, and it was taking over. The way China operates is if you take the solar supply chain, polysilicon gets formed into ignits, gets sliced into wafers, gets mounted onto cells, and then cells get put on modules, and then you buy your modules and you install them over here. They monopolized ignit formation and wafer slicing, and they were driving people out of the market. And I remember, pitching a company that you would all be familiar with that has very glossy booths at the COP meetings, the global warming meetings, and VPs of sustainability and all of that stuff. And the head of procurement doesn't care about all that. That's, of course, who you're selling to when you supply such companies. And I remember telling this person that, it's kind of hard to compete on price. Like they had gotten an offer from China to take business that my company had. And talked to this person. I said, like they're not treating the waste, and there's slave labor issues, and they're stealing IP, and all the things that China does. And the person just coldly looked at me and said, "That's for the courts to decide. Meet the price or lose the business." And there's no real commitment to sustainability in these big companies. It's all for show. They're all phonies. Seen it. They're very proud to sponsor these events and to look good. That's just phony. It's marketing. And so that is an example of free market failure. And having lived it, you become cynical. Like I remember personally observing the first Frankenstein mobile. It was a BYD car in late 2000s, an auto show in Shanghai, I believe I was. And it was on the outside a carbon copy of a Toyota Corolla. And then on the inside, it was the best technology stolen from Mitsubishi, Honda, GM, Ford, Volkswagen. Whatever was the best bit, they just stuffed it in this car. Okay, so BYD back then, everyone laughed. Oh, this is a joke. This company was known as Build Your Dreams. Warren Buffett invested in it. Now it's wiping the world. It's crushing Tesla. It's going to crush all of the big automakers over here. The Fords and the GMs and the Volkswagens of the world are capitalized to compete globally. They will have no chance competing against BYD and their ilk, because if you can just take the best of what everybody has spent decades paying to develop and just put it into your cars, you leapfrog everybody. Do you think it's fair? No, it's not fair. This is free market sort of failures, right? And so, but it happens. It's reality. China plays a very dirty game. They're brass knuckles, and frankly, that in many cases they have won. Like they have reached escape velocity. They produce 2.2 times more electricity than the U.S. Like, they're a behemoth now. We joke that they are the arsenal of democracy because they make all the critical weapon systems for the West. I saw somewhere, probably the Wall Street Journal, that like 70 or 75% of the military supply chain is threatened by China. How did we get here? It's a scandal, actually. But there'll be money to be made closing that loop, and that's what we're most interested in.
When you look across the landscape as it sits right now, I was actually just looking at a chart of BYD, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's in the middle of a price war right now in China, though.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a party. But I'm curious, when you look across these different conflicts, as always, there's a million things going on. And of those million things, we can arguably bubble a few of them down. And there's really two specific that I want to talk about first, which is internal to the US. We're talking about the different domestication efforts, the onshoring. We're talking about trying to bolster manufacturing, especially for like critical components, quote unquote. But how much of this do you think it is the corporate world just placating Trump and essentially setting a timer, saying this dude's gone soon. So sure, yeah, we'll give you a couple $100 billion. We don't really care. That'll placate you for the time being. And then as soon as there's turnover, we're going to see what the new landscape looks like, wait it out, and then hopefully not have to like actually go through with this process.
You know, we wrote a piece early on in the Trump administration called Whiplash, which covered this exact phenomenon. It is patently unfair what happened to the wind sector. And by the way, we're no fans of the wind sector, have been writing critically about wind for many years. But objectively, it is patently unfair what happened to them. For years, the Obama administration had been demanding, promising, paying for, giving grants to support a massive build out of wind. We think that was a mistake. But in so doing, they marshaled scores of billions of investor capital to the task. And suddenly, the Trump administration has literally put an end to all of that and impaired all that capital. And by the way, you could argue, well, they should have known that it's bad technology and you can't, if you need the government, then you shouldn't really be investing, yada, 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 yada. Okay, but it's still unfair in our view. And the exact same thing will happen if the Democrats take over in 2028, to your point. So the way we described it in that piece is that the real danger from all of this is that the planning cycle of heavy industry is longer than the political cycle in the US. The capital planning cycle is out of phase, and there are very few heavy industries that enjoy bipartisan support. And in fact, if the Republicans lose the midterms, you could begin to see people looking at their watches long before Trump's term is finished. There's a long shot flyer risk to all of this, though, which I haven't really spoken about, and we certainly haven't written about, but I'll express it here with you. I think I mentioned it on one podcast. There is a danger that ironically would overcome the risk you and I have just been talking about. And the danger is this. Once you start arresting former presidents, it's kind of hard to stop. Throughout history, whenever a country starts arresting its former leaders, it escalates for a very brief time. And then what happens is existing presidents don't leave because they don't want to get arrested. And the US is getting pretty close to that. So the US arrested a former president in 2023. That man is Donald Trump. Whatever you think of the man, whatever you think of the charges, I don't care. I have my own views, of course, but they're irrelevant to the analysis at hand. Trump is now talking about arresting President Obama and perhaps former candidate and former First Lady Hillary Clinton and all manner of people for the Russiagate scandal. By the way, full disclosure, I think it was indeed a scandal. Borderline treasonous, what happened? It's outrageous to read those documents. Everybody deserves their day in court. But I do think that President Obama and the US intelligence community railroaded Trump's first presidency. That's pretty clear. And any unbiased observer of those documents would come to that conclusion. But having said that, and while I understand there would be a strong desire for retribution, especially on the part of those who were, say, arrested because of this or connected to Trump and all of that stuff, it is a dangerous, very slippery slope. Not sure that even now the US will be able to get off it. So there is a world, ironically, where we have single party rule in the US, and for a time that exceeds the capital planning cycle of heavy industries, you might see a bit of relief on that variable, but then it comes with a different one, which is, totalitarian regimes tend not to be conducive for capital formation either. So, as you say, complex system, many ways to look at it.
Zooming now to be a little more external, I'm curious what your thoughts are your thoughts are on the various conflicts that are going right now. We've talked about actually pretty much all of them previously. So that tells us, some of them multiple times. So it tells us that they're still here, still not going away. Of the different conflicts, that are happening globally right now, which have your attention the most?
Yeah, obviously Russia, Ukraine. This is the one that will decide Trump's presidency in many ways. It will decide the future of the European Union. Um, it will def it will decide whether or not the U.S. will ever be in a position to confront China. Um, and it's coming to a head. And so it's a very dangerous period, by the way, right now. But that is the one that matters the most. Um, as we wrote in a piece last week called Crescendo, the war in Ukraine is really just the latest battle in World War III, which we think started when Putin ditched treasuries and started buying gold. In the global south, all of these wars, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, the war in over Russia and in Ukraine, the potential skirmish over Taiwan, and even the tariffs campaign are really just fight to the death with the BRICS countries over the future of the US dollar. That's how it's being portrayed in their propaganda. Whether or not you believe that doesn't make it less true to them. And so, in a world where either Trump capitulates to Putin's demands, which we don't think is likely, or Russia achieves sort of a definitive military victory over effectively what is a war with NATO, in either of those scenarios, then the European Union has suffered a catastrophic defeat. Trump could survive it because he's been blaming this is Biden's war, this is Biden's war, this is Biden's war, which is true, by the way. I actually don't think there would be a war in Ukraine if Trump had won re-election in 2016, or sorry, in 2020. But that's the one that matters. I have no idea, as we said in the piece, how Trump gets out of this. We hope he does. We hope that peace emerges for obvious reasons, including, you know, humanitarian ones. But it's not. I don't know how he gets out of it. I don't know how. I don't know how this ends other than militarily. And wars that end militarily have the terms of peace dictated by the winners, right? And so we'll see. I note with interest the relative alarm in Kiev, perhaps understandable. Zelensky's posts on Twitter sort of warning Trump to not talk to Putin without at least having him and EU represented, as it's old tapes from the first time that the US and Russia started talking to each other. All kinds of spin and preemptive propaganda in the various outlets on both sides, to be fair. So who knows? It's impossible to say what the true discussions are going on. We hope President Trump can cut a deal in a way that is meaningful and lasting. It's hard to see what that deal encompasses, but we shall see.
Last question on that specifically. How is the conflict gone based on like your first analysis? So if you reflect back to when Russia Ukraine first began, what were your thoughts then? And how has it evolved against those expectations?
So before the war, we thought it would be impossible that the war would happen, and we couldn't imagine that Europe would be spoiling for a fight either, because Europe depended so much on Russia for its energy. You know, we start everything from an energy perspective, and it's very clear that the entire Russian economy was basically not the entire, but the foundation of Russia's economy, of Europe's economy, was based on cheap Russian gas. And once that's cut off, I mean, you know, you end up in the situation that Europe is in now. And we just assumed a deal would be cut because it had to be cut. A deal wasn't cut. Putin invaded. NATO decided, I think it's pretty clear, to scuttle the peace negotiations in Istanbul and fight a protracted war with Russia, a conventional war with Russia, which it was always bound to lose because of supply chains. In the beginning, we just assumed, you know, that the war wouldn't happen, and we didn't know all that much about it. 18 months ago, I personally started following the war very, very closely because I decided I needed to understand it better because of its impact on energy, by the way. If this were a war that had no impact on energy, I don't think I would have taken the time to spend as much and to invest as much as I and the team have in trying to learn about it. And there's all manner of open source intelligence that you can find. And propaganda, we read all the propaganda, the British, the Ukrainian, the Russian, the Iranian, the Chinese, the American. But also, there's a whole collection of open source intelligence with various biases that are kind of self-correcting. One of the projects we follow most closely, it happens to be a Ukrainian one, because we want to, if they're saying things are going in a certain way and it's unfavorable to Ukraine, then it's probably more likely to be at least that bad. You know how it is when you judge people on Twitter, like, oh, this account is reliable, this one is bombastic, this one is an engagement harvester. You just put people into buckets, you put sources into buckets, and over time. And what our view is now, which we came to last year, maybe 6 months into the analysis, we put a Doom Zoom presentation called Sleepwalking into the Abyss. And predominant in that presentation was one of the great questions, which we still don't know, is how does NATO lose this war? Like, how do they actually accept defeat in this war without escalating to nuclear? Russia is fighting a grinding war of attrition. It is a military industrial power, not a gas station masquerading as a country. I think that's incredibly naive and dangerous to say. And their supply chains are right there. And NATO supply chains are over here or back integrated to China. And the US is running dangerously low on air defense missiles. That much is very clear. Trump has said it. Mark Rubio has said it. The Ukrainians have been complaining loudly about it. And Russia is just ramping up, really. The head of NATO, Mark Rutte, has openly admitted that Russia is producing 4 times the pace of all of NATO combined. And that's before you include any help they get from North Korea, Iran, or China. And so that war, which is a war of attrition, wars of attrition aren't usually characterized by large sweeping changes of land until the very end, when the attrition has reached a critical phase. And I think the evidence that what I'm saying is true, which, by the way, is probably not going to be popular with some people and certainly very different than how it's being portrayed in the Western propaganda outlets. But the clearest evidence is one side is desperate for a ceasefire and the other is happy to keep the war going. When you're winning, you're not asking for ceasefires. And so how Trump gets out of this is going to be the ultimate test of his presidency. We pray for him. We would like to see an end to the war. The greatest victims of this war, of course, are the people of Ukraine, by far. There's going to be a lot of questions to be asked when this is over. And the Europeans are in panic. And so that's the state of things. And then, of course, are somewhat controversial, but I think in hindsight, totally correct views on the war between Israel and Iran flowed from that, because if the U.S. is short of air defense missiles and Israel relies on the U.S. for 80% of its air defense missiles, if Iranian missiles were still getting through after 2 or 3 or 4 days, we knew that war had to end quickly, and it did. So there's a lot to be learned out there. You have to be able to, again, think laterally about these things, develop axioms that others might be uncomfortable doing some deductive reasoning on. But there's a lot of signal out there, and there's also a ton of noise. And you just have to get better at recognizing propaganda for what it is, raw data for what it is, and trust your own instincts and your own analysis skills built up over time.
Last question. Looking out over the tail half of this year, what are like the top 2 to 3 items, define item however you feel like, that you are most interested in? Obviously, we probably just covered one of them, but
yeah, the top one is resolution of the war in Ukraine. The second one is resolution of the trade war with China. Third is whether the war between Iran and Israel heats back up. Totally possible that it will. And then fourth is the fate of India and Brazil in this whole battle with the BRICS, and how they respond to Trump's tariff threats will be telling as well. And then, of course, on the energy side, we're always on the lookout for a natural hydrogen breakthrough, abiotic oil breakthrough, geothermal breakthrough. Those are the types of things that could be game changing that we will have, put on people's radars early, and then we'll be well prepared to write about it when we see it.
Okay, last question for real this time. You said something there I'm super curious about. For number 2, you mentioned the China-US trade war. not asking for like specific probabilities, but do you think that that's something that we might see actual meaningful progress this year, or do you expect it to be the kind of thing that just, talking points but
Well,
defer?
no, we have to see meaningful progress because the Chinese are still holding back critical materials. That is alarming the defense industry. And I think Trump's threat of 100% tariffs on those who buy Russian oil was always a bluff that was going to be called. And effectively, the announcement of this summit with Putin is sort of a delay or a recognition that that was a bluff that he just can't do. He can't impose 100% tariffs on China today. Maybe get away with some of it on India, but they produce a lot of pharmaceuticals that we need, and the people can fight back. That's the thing about these types of conflicts is if you don't have escalation dominance, then you shouldn't bluff. And in our view, Trump does not have escalation dominance in the conventional military conflict with Russia if he doesn't want to use nuclear weapons, and let's hope he doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. And he does not have escalation dominance with China for the reasons we have articulated. And so, with those as your axioms, you read the news, you say, well, that's a bluff. Can't do it, right? And so I think the Biden administration left Trump with a very mixed bag. And how Trump cleans up those messes will define his presidency. Unfortunately, the situations he inherited were so far gone that it's hard to envision, quote, cleaning them up without taking an L or two. And Trump's personality is inconsistent with taking an L. And that is the great sort of puzzle of the moment. Having said that, he is a businessman who has taken some L's in the business world and knows when to file for bankruptcy on a project, so who knows? But the summit with Putin, if it happens, will undoubtedly be the geopolitical event that defines Trump's presidency and his legacy. And like all sort of singularity events, it's very hard to predict the other side of it because the laws of physics kind of break down for that moment. So we shall see what happens. It's fascinating time to be writing about these things and to be talking about them on podcasts like this. So under the assumption that was indeed your last question, I'd like to finish my last answer by thanking you for having me back on and expressing what a pleasure it is to join you for these conversations.
Your assumption was spot on. It was awesome hanging out as per usual. I guess that is kind of a partial lie. I do have one more, but it's standard. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, Doomberg.com for everything. We have our articles, about 90 of them a year. That's our annual tier. Our pro tier get those articles, and a monthly webinar where we do a deep dive. We've done them on gold, on geopolitics, on all manner of things. The next one coming up is on lateral thinking. We haven't announced it yet, but I've got an outline pretty much done. And that's a bit more pricey, but our audience can afford it. And all of our podcast appearances are there under our Doomcast. And we have a merchandise store that we're kind of soft launching right now called doomberg.myshopify.com. We finally found a merchandise supplier consistent with our brand ambition, so you can get hats and t-shirts and golf balls and mini Yeti mugs over there. But that's not a profit center for us, of course. That's just sort of a fun branding exercise. But if people want to check that out, they can do that too. Eric, always a pleasure to talk to you soon.
Beautiful. See ya.